Hey, what's up, everybody? True Boxing here. Thank you for coming back to Get Hit with the Truth. So today we are continuing my 2023 Boxing Awards. And this award is the most anticipated fight of the year. Now, before we get into that, if you could smash the like button, leave a comment, or subscribe to the channel, I really do appreciate any and all support that I can get as I continue to build my channel here. So the most anticipated fight of the year, what does it mean? Well, it really covers the top fights that everybody wanted to see going into the fight. Now, the result doesn't matter. It has to do with what we wanted to see going into it. So how the hype was, the names, what was on the line, all that stuff. And again, the result does not matter. It doesn't matter what the result was, is how hyped we were going into the fight. So I'm going to go through every one of my divisions. I have 3 candidates from each division. I have 12 finalists. So when I mention a fight, I'll say this fight is a finalist if it is, and then I will wait to discuss the fight until we get to the top 12. But if it's not a finalist, I will discuss it now. So let's kick it off. Well, first, if you guys want a definition of the most anticipated fight of the year, last year's most anticipated fight of the year was the rematch between Alexander Usyk and Anthony Joshua for the unified light heavyweight title. That was what I felt was the most anticipated fight of the year going in going into it. So that's the definition. So let's start with the 122-pound division. Look at the 3 candidates there. First off, at 122, we will go with, and actually I was able to do these divisions from 3 to 1, the third best down to the first best, in my opinion, in each division. So the third best at 122 was Marlon Tapales and MJ. I'm sorry, I am off right here. Give me 1 second. No, that is wrong. It is Luis Nery versus Azat Hovhannissian in a final eliminator in February. Now, this fight ended up being a fight of the year candidate, but going in, this was a highly anticipated fight because you had Nery, who's a top contender, former 2-division world champion, and you have Azat Hovhannissian, who was the boogeyman of 122 for years. For about 3 or 4 years, nobody wanted to fight him. He could not get a big fight, and going in, this was a huge fight that a lot of people were surprised that Nery took to get a final eliminator. So Nery, with all his experience, former 2-division champ, and Azat Hovhannissian being a feared fighter, everybody was really hyped up in boxing to, now in terms of big time names, neither one of these guys are that, but the boxing world was highly anticipated for this DAZN main event that took place in February. So that finished number 3. Now, number 2, in terms of anticipated, most anticipated, and you know what? I'm going to take the ranking system out of it. I'm going to mix it up now. Not even number 2 or number 1. Just the next candidate at 122 was Naoya Inoue and Marlon Tapales for the undisputed title that took place in December. I mean, this is a finalist. We'll discuss this when we get to the top 12. The next candidate at 122 was Naoya Inoue and Stephen Fulton Jr. as they competed for the unified super bantamweight title back in July. That is also a finalist. We'll discuss that when we get to the top 12. Now we'll go to 126 featherweight and look at the 3 candidates there. First off was Lee Wood versus Josh Warrington for the WBA featherweight title, the fight that took place in October. This was a highly anticipated fight. They're not a finalist, highly anticipated fight right here, especially a UK fight. These 2 guys have been circling each other for a couple years, and finally, with Wood being the champion, he had filed an exemption to not make a mandatory to get the Josh Warrington fight, and this was a huge showdown for the UK. A lot of people were looking forward to it. Warrington being a former 2-time champ and coming off of a great performance against Luis Alberto Lopez the year before in defeat, and Lee Wood, who had suffered a defeat earlier in the year, a knockout against Lara, and then come back and defeated him to regain the WBA belt. A lot of people were very much so looking forward to that one. Then Then it's Mauricio Lara against Lee Wood in their rematch is the next candidate. Lara had taken the title from Lee Wood in February by knockout. So a rematch clause was in the contract for Lee Wood, and he activated it for the month of May, which was big because Mauricio Lara did not take their rematch serious. But hyping it up until the day before, a lot of people were very much so looking forward to the rematch because Lee Wood had clinically outboxed Mauricio Lara the entire fight before he got caught and dropped in the 7th round, and his corner would throw in the towel, stopping the fight. So a lot of people wanted to see if Lee Wood could avoid getting knocked out in a rematch and outbox him. Now he did that, but the day before, Lara took a lot of steam from this fight when he came in overweight and lost the titles on the scales. Even though the title was vacant and was up for grabs for Lee Wood, it was not up for grabs for Mauricio Lara the night of the fight. So it definitely took steam out of the fight. But up until the weigh-in the day before, this was a very highly anticipated rematch. The third candidate at 126 is Brandon Figueroa and Mark Magsayo, as they would compete for the vacant WBC interim title in March of 2023. You know, this was just it was a good matchup on paper because Brandon Figueroa had made his debut at 126 and dominated Carlos Castro the year before. So everybody knew that he was on the verge of getting some kind of an eliminator or a title shot. And Mark Magsayo had upset Gary Russell Jr. in 2022 and then lost it by a razor close split decision to Ray Vargas in July. So they wanted the winner of this fight to fight Vargas for the title. So there was a lot riding on this one. Figueroa had to prove himself at 126, and Magsayo wanted to bounce back and get his rematch against Vargas. So highly anticipated showdown right here. Ended up being a really good fight too, but that has nothing to do with the, with this award. Next at 130, we didn't have any finalists there, so 1 to 3, or 3 to 1 in my book. We start with Emmanuel Navarrete versus Robson Conceição for the WBO super featherweight title back in November. This actually was on an ESPN undercard. It was a co-feature, but a lot of people were looking at it as a double main event, which it was. I mean, Navarrete and Conceição was highly anticipated. Navarrete was coming off of a big win over Oscar Valdez, the biggest of his career. He dominated him over 12 rounds, and he was taking on the very durable, very good Robson Conceição, who had fought for titles twice and almost, and should have been awarded the WBC title a couple years earlier in what should have been a victory over Oscar Valdez, but the fight went to Valdez instead. So Conceição was really looking to provide a tough challenge, and Navarrete, 3 months off of the victory over Valdez, was still hungry and wanting to prove why he felt he was a top dog at 130. Number 2 was Shavkat Rakhimov versus Joe Cordina, as they fought for the IBF super featherweight title back in April. Rakhimov was the undefeated champion. Cordina was the mandatory challenger and the former champion. Cordina had been stripped of the belt for not being able to make his mandatory against Rakhimov in November of 2022. He had to pull out with an injury, and because the IBF had 2 mandatory challengers, they stripped Cordina, made him the #1 contender, and allowed Rakhimov to fight the other mandatory, Zelfa Barrett, for the vacant title. Rakhimov took a knockdown and then ended up coming back and knocking out Barrett in the later rounds to secure the title. But the showdown with Joe Cordina was on. It would take place in Cordina's backyard of the United Kingdom. So a lot of people were looking forward to this one at 122 to see who was, the top dog at the moment, with Navarrete. It was like a top 2 or 3 fight right here, with Navarrete entering the division as well. So the division was still up for grabs when this fight was coming up to take place. So a lot was riding on it. And then the most anticipated fight of the year at 130 pounds for me was a fight that almost made it into the top 12. Emmanuel Navarrete and Oscar Valdez, as they fought for the WBO title in August. This was a fight that was supposed to take place in February for the vacant WBO title, Valdez had to pull out with an injury, so Navarrete would fight for the title against Liam Wilson. And in his debut at 130, it took a knockdown in that fight. He would break down Wilson the remainder of the fight and stop him in 9. But heading into this fight with Valdez, who had been competing at 130 for about 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of people wondering if Navarrete could hold his own, as he had dominated 122 and 126 already. But there was also a lot of people, myself included, that were looking at it like Valdez wasn't going to pose as big of a threat to Navarrete as other people might. So it was a lot, but at the very end, people were really anticipating a big all-Mexican showdown, and we're really looking forward to it. And this was a battle to really prove in the wide open 130-pound division who was number one, because Valdez had lost the number one status when he lost to Shakur Stevenson the year before, but he could very easily get it back with a win over Navarrete, who was many people's number one, my number one at 126 featherweight entering 2023. So this one for me was a true battle to determine the lead front runner for the division at 130 pounds. So this was a big one, which Navarrete ended up winning by a clean unanimous decision and scored the biggest win of his career. 135, we have 3 candidates there. One of them is a finalist, so I'm not going to go in order here from 3 to 1 or whatever. So the first candidate is Devin Haney versus Vasily Lomachenko for the undisputed lightweight championship of the world. That took place in May. That is a finalist. We will discuss that when we get to the top 12. Next was Tank Davis versus Hector Luis Garcia, as they competed for the WBA regular lightweight title in early January. This fight, Tank Davis, whenever he fights, it's a big deal. But heading in against Hector Luis Garcia, it was a decent matchup, but there wasn't anybody that didn't think Tank was going to win this fight. He was a heavy favorite. Garcia was coming up from 130. He was undefeated and the WBA champion at 130, but nobody was really giving him a chance because this was widely viewed as a tune-up bout for the eventual Tank Davis-Ryan Garcia fight. So that's why this fight didn't make it in as a finalist. But it was, anytime Tank fights, it was a big one. And Hector Luis Garcia was a top 5 fighter at 130. So there was some interest in if Garcia could pull it off. But again, nobody was really giving him a chance. But anytime Tank fights, it's a big deal. And the final candidate was Shakur Stevenson versus Edwin De Los Santos, as they competed for the vacant WBC title in November in the main event of an ESPN card. A lot of people were looking forward to this one. Stevenson was, is the next big thing, what most people, myself included, feel is going to be the future pound for pound king of boxing. He was heading into this one after debuting earlier in the year at lightweight and getting a dominant victory over an undefeated Japanese fighter and stopping him. He was coming in against De Los Santos, who had stopped Jose Valenzuela and was a highly touted contender. And a lot of people were looking forward to this fight because De Los Santos could box and had a pretty good punch as well, and was young like Stevenson. So a lot of people were looking forward to it. A vacant title was on the line as Devin Haney gave up his belt to move up to 140 and was declared a champion in recess. So a lot of people wanted to see Shakur secure that title in dominant fashion so he could set up bigger fights in 2023. Next, we move on to the 140-pound division and look at the candidates there, which 2 of the 3 fights ended up being finalists. First off was Tank Davis versus Ryan Garcia, which was technically a 140-pound battle because they met at a catchweight of 136, 1 pound above the 135-pound lightweight limit. So technically, this was a junior welterweight battle at 140, and this was also a finalist, so we'll discuss this when we get to the top 12. Next candidate was Josh Taylor versus Teofimo Lopez for the WBO junior welterweight title. This was also a finalist, so I will discuss this one when we get to the top 12. And the final candidate was Regis Prograis versus Devin Haney for the WBC title. A lot of people were looking forward to this one. This one almost made it as a finalist. A lot of people were looking forward to this one because Devin Haney, the undisputed lightweight champion, had scored that controversial decision victory over Vasily Lomachenko, and really, was a big name in the sport. And he had decided to move up to 140 to take on Prograis, who entering 2023 was sitting at the top of the division with Josh Taylor. But a lot of steam had been taken away from Prograis when he, based on his performance against Danielito Zorrilla back in June. And that's why, for me, this just missed out on being a finalist, because I think a lot of people were looking at Devin Haney to cleanly outbox Prograis, and I think there was some people giving Prograis a puncher's chance. I was one of those guys, but I really did think Devin was going to win this fight going in. So I think that took some of the steam away from this fight, and that's why this fight didn't end up being a finalist. Now we'll look at 147 welterweight and look at our three candidates there, one finalist. So first up was the big one, Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. for the undisputed welterweight championship of the world. This absolutely was a finalist. We'll talk about that when we get to the top 12. Then there was Yordenis Ugas versus Mario Barrios for the vacant WBC interim title. This is a big fight for Ugas. It was on a big card. It was on the Canelo Charlo undercard in September. And Ugas, this was basically viewed as his comeback to the division after his beatdown he suffered a year and a half earlier against Errol Spence Jr. in their title unification bout at welterweight. So a lot of people were looking at this one as Ugas was just going to outbox Mario Barrios and put himself back in line for a world title shot. But there were a lot of people going in that thought Barrios stood a serious chance, and I was one of those because of his height and his youth and his size. But Ugas was still the betting favorite, but a lot of people were looking forward to this bout going down on the Canelo undercard, so that's why this one was a candidate. Next up was Jerome Boots Ennis against Romain Villa. That fight took place for the IBF interim title in July. People were looking forward to this one because Boots is a big attraction, and a lot of people wanted to see him against Villa, who had upset Rashidi Ellis on the Tank Davis and Hector Luis Garcia undercard earlier in the year. And he is a power-punching Colombian fighter, so a lot of people were looking forward to him and Boots going at it for the interim title in July. So that's why this one made it. 154, super welterweight. We're going to go from 3 to 1 because this division did not get a finalist in the top 12. Number 3 was Erickson Lubin versus Jesus Ramos. That fight took place in September on the Canelo versus Charlo undercard. And this one was highly touted at 154 because it was seen as a true competitive final eliminator for the next fighter to possibly receive a title shot. As Erickson Lubin, the former world title challenger, was coming off a fight of the year before against Sebastian Fundora, and was looking to bounce back after a victory earlier in the year and get right back in title contention against the undefeated 22-year-old Ramos, who really was rolling coming into this fight. And a lot of people, I think there was more people assuming that Ramos was going to win, but Lubin still being a young fighter and a good, solid boxer, a lot of people were wondering what kind of fight this would be. It was a 50-50 fight going in with a lot of anticipation for the future for the winner. So that's why this one made it. Then there was Tim Tszyu and Tony Harrison for the WBO interim title that took place in March. Tszyu was undefeated, was rolling. He was supposed to get the title shot against Charlo for the undisputed title, but Charlo pulled out with an injury. So Tszyu went forward to take on former champion Tony Harrison, who's the only guy to hand Charlo a loss prior to Canelo. And but Charlo had also avenged that loss against Harrison. But Harrison the year before bounced back and dominated Sergio Garcia. And a lot of people were wondering if Tony Harrison was back and if he could give Tim Tszyu trouble heading into this fight. I admit I picked Tony Harrison to beat Tim Tszyu heading into this fight. And Tim Tszyu being undefeated fighting at home, a lot was riding on this one, especially the WBO interim belt. And then the other finalist, the number one fight, the most anticipated fight at 154 for me in 2023 was Tim Tszyu and Brian Mendoza for the WBO super welterweight title. a lot was made of this fight. It took place in Australia. Tim Tszyu had rolled through Tony Harrison and Carlos Ocampo earlier in the year and had been upgraded to WBO champ when Charlo moved up to fight Canelo for the undisputed title. He got the upgrade. So this one meant a lot for Tim Tszyu. It meant a lot for him heading into this one against Mendoza, because Mendoza was the WBC interim champion and had upset Sebastian Fundora with a brutal knockout earlier in the year. So a lot was riding on it. A lot of people were looking forward to seeing how Tim Tszyu would do against a guy who could take punches and deal punches. So it was a highly anticipated first title defense for Tim Tszyu. Next are three candidates at middleweight 160. None were finalists, so we'll go 3-1. Number 3 was Janibek Alamanhalai against Vicente Gualtieri in their title unification bout that took place in October. Janibek was a WBO champ and was widely considered to be the most feared man at middleweight, and was coming in against undefeated Vicente Gualtieri, who had upset Esquiva Falcao to capture the vacant IBF title in July. So these two guys were unifying belts to really put a lockdown on half of the 154-pound titles at 160. I mean, 160-pound titles. And I thought it was a good matchup to watch, because to control half of the division gives you a lot of pull, even in a wide open division. So a lot of people were paying attention and looking forward to this one at 160. Number 2 goes to the first fight between Chris Eubank and Liam Smith when they competed in January. Chris Eubank coming in was a highly touted middleweight, former champ, and was coming in against Liam Smith, a former champ at 154. I'm sorry, Chris Eubank is not a former champ. He is a former world title challenger, but highly touted. And a lot of people were wondering if Liam Smith, making the jump to 160, if he could take the weight and the size of Eubank, who had fought up at 168 for a world title. So coming into this one, it was an all UK battle that people were really looking forward to seeing how it would shake out. And that's what, why my number 1 candidate is Liam Smith versus Chris Eubank 2 in their rematch that took place in September. This fight was highly anticipated because Chris Eubank was the betting favorite heading into the first fight, and Liam Smith would upset him with a 4th-round TKO victory, which was surprising because Liam Smith not known to be a huge power puncher, and Chris Eubank has always taken punches well. So Eubank getting stopped like that was unprecedented, and a lot of people were very surprised, myself included. So the rematch in the UK, and really for the middleweight division, was that much more anticipated and a big deal, and was the most anticipated fight of the year at middleweight for me. Excuse me one second. 168, super middleweight. There's 3 candidates there. 2 of them are finalists, so we're not going to do in order. First up was David Benavidez and Demetrius Andrade as they competed for the WBO interim title. That's a finalist, so we'll discuss that in the top 12. Next was Canelo Alvarez against Jermell Charlo for the undisputed super middleweight title. That took place in September. That is also a finalist. We'll discuss that in the top 12. And the third candidate, believe it or not, was, and some people are going to argue this one, and that's okay, but I had David Benavidez against Caleb Plant for the WBC interim title. It was not a finalist, though, a top 12 finalist, but a fight that just missed the cut was Canelo and John Ryder that took place in May for the undisputed title. I'm sorry, that wasn't as widely viewed because most people viewed that as a one-sided fight, as Benavidez and Plant. Benavidez and Plant was a big deal because David Benavidez, a lot of people have been wanting to see him fight Canelo for a couple of years now, but he hadn't gotten that signature win over a top-tier fighter yet. He had defeated Anthony Dirrell, which was impressive to capture the WBC belt a couple of years earlier, but even that fight, most people were like, so what, you know? Caleb Plant was a former IBF champion who went 11 rounds with Canelo, and that was the only guy Canelo had lost to, and he was competitive in that fight, boxing. So David Benavidez had to be that competitive against Plant, in order to eventually secure a fight with Canelo, or to truly knock on the door and call Canelo a duck. And this one led to, the bigger fight for David. But for Caleb Plant too, this was his way of getting back in the mix, because David had done something that had brutally knocked out, Caleb Plant had brutally knocked out Anthony Dirrell in October of the previous year, as he had bounced back from the Canelo loss in 2021. So Plant was still considered to be a top 3 super middleweight heading into this one, top 3 or 4. And David Benavidez was widely regarded as the number 2 super middleweight in all the world. So this was a big time fight for the interim belt, and a lot of people were looking forward to it. Now the 3 candidates at 175, nothing made my top 12, so we'll go 3-1. Number 3 was Jean Pascal and Michael Eifert in their IBF final eliminator that took place in March. Pascal was the 40-year-old drinking from the fountain of youth. Most people expected him to win. He was the favorite coming in, a former 2-time champ, going in against Eifert, who was widely unknown. But still, a lot of people were looking forward to seeing if Pascal was going to punch a ticket for another title shot, in his future. So this was a big deal. Number 2 goes to Dimitri Bivol versus Lyndon Arthur for the WBA light heavyweight title that took place on the Day of Reckoning card in December. Dimitri Bivol hadn't fought all year. Canelo had avoided a rematch with him, so he was looking to secure a fight ahead of a potential undisputed showdown with Artur Beterbiev in 2024, and he would take on UK contender Lyndon Arthur, who had upset Anthony Yarde a couple years earlier. Yarde returned the favor, knocking out Arthur, but still, Arthur was considered a legitimate contender against Bivol because he was a boxer, and the fact that the fight was taking place on the Day of Reckoning card made this fight even bigger. So it was anticipated. But number 1 for me, the most anticipated fight of the year at 175 light heavyweight, was for sure Artur Beterbiev versus Anthony Yarde for the unified title that took place in January. Beterbiev was the reigning unified champ. Anthony Yarde was a WBO mandatory challenger, it was his second crack at a title. He had almost upset Sergey Kovalev a couple years earlier, and he was coming in against Beterbiev, who had knocked every opponent out. And with Yarde's power, a lot of people were looking forward to seeing if he could make a dent in this mandatory fight against Beterbiev. So this one was the most anticipated fight of the year for me at light heavyweight 175. Next, the 3 candidates at cruiserweight 200 pounds. None of them made the were finalists. So let's look at these fights. Overall, again, none of these fights were candidates for most anticipated fight of the year. Finalist, I'm sorry. So from 3-1 goes to Jaio Pitaya versus Ellis Zorro, as they competed on the Day of Reckoning card in a cruiserweight bout. I just did this one because Jaio Pitaya is the number 1 cruiserweight in the world. A lot of people wanted to see him fight whoever, and he was taking on an undefeated UK but unknown fighter in Ellis Zorro. But Zorro, again, undefeated, but this was on the Day of Reckoning card, and it was the number 1 cruiserweight in the world fighting on that card. So a lot of people were looking forward to it. Number 2 was Ilunga Makabu against Badou Jack, as they competed for the WBC title on the Jake Paul undercard in February on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. Makabu had been the champion for a couple years and a true cruiserweight, taking on the 39-year-old Badou Jack, former 2-division champ. A lot of people were looking forward to it, but most people felt Makabu was going to dominate Jack in this fight. But still, it was an anticipated fight because Jack, is a good former 2-division champ, and Makabu was a good, solid veteran. So a lot of people looked forward to that one. And then the most anticipated fight of the year at cruiserweight for me was the contenders bout between Gilberto Ramirez and Joe Smith Jr., as they both made their debut at cruiserweight and fought in October on the Zone. Ramirez was coming off of his first defeat to Dimitri Bivol when he fought him at light heavyweight in 2022 and got dominated over 12. And Joe Smith Jr. was bouncing back after almost a year and a half off and being destroyed against Artur Beterbiev and losing his light heavyweight title. So these 2 former champions were colliding in a new weight class, both bringing names to the weight class, so it was an anticipated fight. Now we look at the 4 candidates at heavyweight, and I did 4. Yes, it's 4 candidates because all 4 were finalists for me in my top 12. So from, just in any random order, no particular order, Tyson Fury, Francis Ngannou in their 10-round heavyweight attraction. AJ Anthony Joshua versus Otto Wallen for their heavyweight showdown that took place on the Day of Reckoning card in December. Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker for their heavyweight showdown that took place on the Day of Reckoning card in December. And finally, Zhilei Zhang versus Joe Joyce in their rematch that took place on ESPN for the WBO interim heavyweight title. All 4 of those are finalists. So let's get to the top 12 now. The finalists, 12-1. Number 12 is the fight I just mentioned. Zhilei Zhang versus Joe Joyce in their rematch for the WBO interim heavyweight title that took place in September. Zhilei Zhang had scored a major upset over Joe Joyce back in April, as Joe Joyce was viewing Zhang as pretty much a setup fight, a stay busy fight ahead of an eventual title shot. Zhang coming in, he pulled off the upset, battered Joe Joyce's eye. Joe Joyce activated the rematch in this fight, and the two would square off we're squaring off in September. And a lot of people were wondering, was this a legit win? Is Zhilei Zhang better? Or did Joe Joyce's eye just get swollen too early and he got beat up in the process? So this fight was highly anticipated to secure maybe the most feared contender in the division going forward, and to secure the winner an eventual world title shot. Number 11, Josh Taylor versus Teofimo Lopez for the WBO junior welterweight title that took place in June. Some people might argue this one, but this was a big fight. Josh Taylor, undefeated, former undisputed champion, was bouncing back, still the number 1 fighter in the division heading into 2023, but with a lot of questions because of his controversial victory over Jack Catterall the year before. He had given up 3 of his 4 belts in order to get a rematch with Catterall, and then decided to not go through with the fight, with the rematch with Catterall. So a lot of people were questioning whether Taylor was taking things serious anymore. And then boom, he signed on to defend his title against his number 1 contender, Teofimo Lopez. And Lopez had even more questioning surrounding him because he had lost 2 years earlier to George Kambosos Jr. and lost his lightweight titles, but he moved up in 2022 to junior welterweight, 140, and had looked okay, but in his recent fight against Sandor Martin, really didn't look that good. It was a questionable win by a close decision, and even after the fight, he questioned if he still had it or not. So a lot of questions were abound heading into this one. Who was going to be the winner? If Taylor or Lopez could find that old form of theirs and bounce back. But it definitely was a big-time fight and a highly anticipated one. Number 10 for me is the Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker heavyweight showdown that took place on the Day of Reckoning card in December. This one was highly anticipated, mainly because it was 2 veteran former champions. Deontay Wilder had held the WBC title for like 5 years before, and just such a big name. His punching power is just godlike. Coming in against the former WBO champion Joseph Parker, who had secured 3 victories in a row since his last defeat, never been knocked out. But more importantly, because this was supposed to be a prelude to a March 2024 showdown for Wilder against Anthony Joshua. And Joshua was fighting in the other part of the double main event here. So a lot riding on this fight. It was highly anticipated. A lot of people were tuning in to see Wilder and Parker. That's why it's number 10. Number 9 was the other part of that double main event, Anthony Joshua versus Otto Wallen. This one was highly anticipated, of course, because Anthony Joshua is a former 2-time unified champ, a huge name, and was 2 fights into the year off of back-to-back losses to Alexander Usyk. He had returned with 2 victories and was really highly doubted and criticized for choosing a southpaw like Wallin for this fight. A lot of people were saying this was a bad choice and that the potential showdown with Deontay Wilder could be ruined by Otto Wallin because Joshua decided to fight Wallin. So a lot of people were criticizing this choice of opponent and wanted to see what Joshua was going to do because that dream match with Joshua was sitting on the horizon for both of them. And it was really, that was a highly anticipated card and fight altogether. The next fight, number 8 on my list for most anticipated fight of the year, was Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou in their heavyweight attraction that took place in October. This one, you can't deny was a big fight because it was a real legitimate fight. It wasn't an exhibition fight, even though most feel it should have been, myself included. Tyson Fury, the undefeated WBC heavyweight champion, non-title fight against the former UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou. A lot of people, casuals especially, were looking forward to this one to see what was going to go down and how a former UFC heavyweight champion could do with the current king of the heavyweight division, Tyson Fury. Number 7 for most anticipated fight of the year goes to Naoya Inoue versus Stephen Fulton Jr. As they competed for the unified super bantamweight title at 122 pounds in July. This one was widely regarded as one of the biggest fights of the year right here because Stephen Fulton Jr. had pretty much secured the top spot and the unified title at 122 when he defeated Brandon Figueroa, about a year and a half or so earlier, just over a year and a half earlier, and also dominated and retired former number 1 in the division, Daniel Romero, a former unified champ, in 2022. So Fulton was rolling as the top guy at 122, and Inoue was a former undisputed champ at 118. He had secured that in December of 2022, vacated all the belts, and made it clear he was moving to he was made it clear he was moving to 122 from 118, and he decided for his debut bout to be against Stephen Fulton Jr., which a lot of people criticized because Fulton was bigger and Inoue had never faced a pure boxer like Stephen Fulton Jr. with his kind of talent. So a lot of people were criticizing and wondering if Inoue could pull this off and viewing this as a 50-50 fight for the unified title right here. So it was a big deal. Number 6 on the year was Canelo Alvarez versus Jermell Charlo for the undisputed super middleweight title. This one, Canelo came in a heavy favorite, but any Canelo fight is a big deal. I mean, widely viewed. And this one was a big deal because Charlo, even though he was moving up 2 weight classes and frame-wise would be smaller, he was still the taller and bigger man than Canelo. And he was the undisputed champ at 154 coming into the fight. So a lot of people were looking forward to this one, to seeing how Charlo would fare against Canelo, and this being a good, very good American fighter coming in against Canelo. So a lot of people were really looking forward to this one, myself included, on how Charlo would do. Number 5 goes to David Benavidez versus Demetrius Andrade for the WBC interim title that took place in October. In November. This one was highly touted because these two guys were viewed as the guys that had been calling out Canelo, and Canelo had told them to fight each other to try to earn a fight with him. So they finally did. Benavidez had signed with the PBC in late 2022, made his debut in 2023, and in his second fight would fight David Benavidez, who was coming off of the destructive victory over Caleb Plant over 12 rounds. So a lot of people wanted to see if the undefeated Benavidez could roll through Andrade, or if Andrade could outclass and outbox the younger Benavidez. A lot of people had their eyes set on this one, as the winner deserves Canelo. So big time fight right there. Number 4 for most anticipated fight of the year goes to Naoya Inoue versus Marlon Tapales for the undisputed super bantamweight title at 122 pounds. This was a big fight right here. You really can't deny this fight and what it meant to boxing. You had Inoue, the top dog in the division, after destroying Stephen Fulton Jr. over 8 rounds, coming in against Tapales, who had pulled off a major upset and defeated Murajan Akhmadaliev back in April to secure the WBA and IBF titles. So a lot of people were crowning Inoue coming in, but this was historic because he was going to be only the second man to secure the undisputed championship in a weight class in the 4-belt era, and in 2 weight classes. I'm sorry, Terrence Crawford being the first one earlier in the year, but Inoue had just secured undisputed at 118 a year prior to this fight. So a lot of people were looking forward to the history that was likely going to be made in December for Inoue. Number 3 for most anticipated fight of the year goes to Tank Davis versus Ryan Garcia, as they fought for the at 136 pounds in a catch weight in April. Heading into this fight, you know, both were undefeated, both have been talking shit a long time, so a lot of casual fans tuned into this one, but a lot of the big name boxing you know, people and deep boxing fans wanted to see this fight as well. But a lot, in my opinion, this fight would have been much bigger if it would have just cleanly taken place at 140 without all the weight restrictions. But Tank Davis put 2 weight clauses on Ryan Garcia. He made him come down from 140 to 136 when Tank had fought at 140 before, which I didn't understand. And then he put on a 10-pound rehydration clause, so Ryan couldn't weigh more than 146 the night of the fight. Be that as it may, it was a huge, huge fight that did over 1 million pay-per-view buys, and that shows you the names in this fight and how big it was. Highly anticipated. Number 2 goes to Devin Haney versus Vasily Lomachenko for the undisputed lightweight championship of the world. This one was huge for boxing because you had Devin Haney, who had taken Loma's spot early in 2022 and fought George Kambosos Jr., dominated him twice to secure and lock down the top spot at 135, taking on the former unified champ Vasily Lomachenko in a huge showdown of young versus old, the young lion versus the old lion, passing of the torch potentially, or Vasily Lomachenko proving he was the top dog. Undisputed title, all 4 belts are on the line. This was a major fight in May on ESPN pay-per-view. And finally, the most anticipated fight of the year for me in boxing, for sure, no doubt, was Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford and their unification bout for the undisputed welterweight championship of the world. This fight was a fight that had been coming for years, and people were super excited when it finally was brought to play. The 2 top dogs in their division, 2 pound for pound top dogs, maybe not 1 and 2 exactly, but right there in the top 5, top 10, fighting to leave no doubt who the better man was. I mean, everybody was looking forward to this fight, and I could not wait to see it. I was salivating for this fight, seriously. To me, and I think most hardcore boxing fans, and maybe to some casuals, this was truly the most anticipated fight of the year for 2023. Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford for the undisputed welterweight championship of the world at 147 pounds. So that's it. That's what I got. That's my 2023 Boxing Awards on my most anticipated fight of the year. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, smash the like button, leave a comment, or subscribe to the channel. I appreciate any and all support. This is True Boxing. You've been hit with the truth.